Hear ye. This is Naval Action's weekly update for the week of 13, and I am your host, Lars Kjær. I would like to start with the current state of RVR. The current state of RVR is pretty much as it was last week. We have the Russian menace that is basically the dominating part of the server, and you have the Swedes who have been offering the resistance to the Russian alliance bloc, and these two blocks is basically still pretty much the same, with very little development going on between them. There was last week the development of the Dutch that switched side to the Russians, but other than that, there haven't been really much change over the course of the week. What we've seen in RVR and in the game in general is, in my opinion, a rather negative development where we have seen multi-flips, no-shows, timer dodging, and I don't really see the game being improved by any of these. I mean, the multi-flips I can understand. It allows the attacker, so to speak, to get into a port without being screened out. So it has, in my opinion, a viable purpose, albeit a negative one, because in general it allows for a lot of sitting in port and making nothing because the opponent didn't show up. The no-shows, in my opinion, are much worse because it basically trolls the opponent. It's the only object of the no-shows. You basically flip a port, then you force the opponent to sit in that port for 31 minutes, something like that. Basically just capping the circles and waiting for the timer to run out. It takes a half an hour from the opponent every single day, and it's, in my opinion, a shitty attrition tactic that shouldn't be allowed in the game, and it shouldn't really be in the game. But at the moment, as the mechanics are, that's what that's what it is, and it's something we have to live with. Admin has informed us that he will implement a solution to these no-shows, but I don't really see how that is possible unless you want to make a lobby-based port battle system, and even then you can't force someone to enter the lobby, even if they can't enter open world and do other stuff in the game on their account. They'll just either not log in, or they will just log into an alt account and play from that one until the port battle is over, and then they can log in. Unless there's some sort of crime and punishment system implemented, I don't really see how it's possible to avoid the no-shows. It's basically a shitty, what's the right word? It's a shitty culture that we have embraced, and I think we've all embraced it because apparently that's what we do in RVR right now. We force the opponent to sit in an empty port battle. As I said, that doesn't really add much to the game. It doesn't really add much to the enjoyment of the game, and it's just a question about breaking the will of whoever is being no-showed to the point where they stop playing, basically. Or at least stop defending. The other thing we've seen in relation to the no-shows is, of course, the timer dodging. Timer dodging is a way to avoid multi-flips, which can be argued is a viable tactic since it enables the country that does the timer dodging. It basically enables them to choose which ports can be attacked and which ports can't. In my opinion, it's the same as the no-shows. There's really no difference between those two. You basically prevent your opponent from playing the game, at least aspects of the game, until such a time where the opponent either gives up and leaves the game, or simply leaves for another nation that isn't subject to these no-shows, timer dodgings. As I see it, it doesn't really add anything to the RVR aspect. It doesn't really add anything to the game. It's basically just players trolling other players, and I really can't see that it gives anything to increase the enjoyment of the game or increase the fun of the game. My views on the timer dodging has been perfectly clear. I consider it basically cowardice, but if I have to be completely honest, so are the no-shows. It's shitty tactics where players are trolling other players, and at the moment I really don't see any solution to either of them, because the timer dodging could be solved by regional servers, for example. But with a player base that generally only hits about 1,100 players in max peak time, a secondary server is really not much of an option. So what do we do then? We could argue for a better culture among the players. There's been some rumblings about that on the forums, but I, for one, has given up on trying to educate the server population. I've just basically embraced the no-shows. Any Swede who knows who I am knows that I don't really care for the no-shows. I don't really care for the timer dodgings. But even I have embraced that's just tactics that we do. We basically just shit on each other. We show a lot of disrespect towards our fellow players. And I really can't see that it improves the game in any way, shape or form. So why are we doing this? Well, it's, as far as I can tell, quite simple. We do it because we can, that's one thing. And the other thing is we do it because we feel it is necessary. There are two things in play here. One is the fear of losing in general. Nobody likes to be on the losing side of a war. And the other one is more important. The cost of losing is simply too large, and that forces players into degenerative and negative gameplays. Basically, why are the Swedes, for example, and now I'm taking the Swedes as an example because they're situated quite close to the Kristianstad region. If we take a short look at the Kristianstad region, the ports around Kristianstad, except actually, ironically enough, Vikes, I'll get back to that one. The ports around Kristianstad, they have all been given so-called night timers, basically US time zone timers, and the reason for that is because the Swedes know that Denmark, Norway don't have a US player base that is large enough to actually field the full port battle fleet in those hours, so they basically just they basically just used it to prevent Denmark, Norway from doing any port battles. That is what it is. I've already said I think it's a bit cowardly, but what has developed here is then that we have just, and now I'm taking my own perspective, so be aware that it's just slightly biased, but basically what we've been doing is that we flip the ports and then we don't show. Which forces the US player base to stay in port for 32 minutes, and if I were the Americans, I would really be pissed off by now. It's a shitty tactic, really. But the cost of losing, we all know what the Danish agenda is. The Danish agenda is to get a decent crafting port. Why do Denmark, Norway want a decent crafting port? Well, because the developers made that shitty decision to make every port have a differentiated point tally, which means the only decent crafting port in the Kristianstad area is St. Johan, which is coincidentally the only reason why the Swedes won't give it up, because it's their only 55-point port, and there is a huge difference between a 55-point port and, for example, a 40-point port. Now, one could argue that the Swedes already have two 50-point ports and that there isn't really that much of a difference between a 50-point port and a 55-point port. To that, I will just say that that's bullshit. Sorry for the phrasing, by the way. At RVR, at some of the port battles that are really, really close, it's the margins that settles the port battles, and it should be the side with the most skill that decides the port battle. It should be the decisions, the side that has the most skill makes in the battle that decides the port battles. As it is at the moment, the port battles are decided by who has the 55-point ships and who has the best modules. And that is basically the reason why we players act as shitty towards one another as we do. So that sums up the state of RVR at the moment, and I will continue now to the Battle of Buena Vista. The Battle of Buena Vista has been, as you can see, a success for the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire attacked Buena Vista and captured Buena Vista, which, as far as I can tell, ends the Swedish campaign towards Cartagena. I was amazed that the Swedes were able to take Buena Vista in the first place. Basically, getting out of Guyana is a shit task, and even approaching Buena Vista from the north would be, if not impossible, then difficult, because you're always subject to being spotted. So as far as I can tell, unless the Swedes really make a huge effort or gets incredibly lucky, the battle for Cartagena is over, or the campaign for Cartagena is over. It was over by the time the Russian won the Battle of Buena Vista. If we proceed to another region, we have the Latter 2 region. As you can tell by the hours, I've made a little black marker on Cap Français. That's because, as far as I could tell, Cap Français wasn't fully set as a port battle, but there was done some hostility on it. Cap Français is in the US time zone, so whether that hostility by the Russians was intended to actually flip the port or was just intended to be another no-show is anyone's guess, basically. You had the pirates attacking and actually capturing Port de Paix. Last week they lost Port de Paix again, and then they took Port de Paix at the same time that Baracoa was taken by the Russians. So it's a little bit back and forth, but to be fair, I think that the Russians has a marked advantage here because they just took Baracoa, which was the pirates' main crafting port. WTF clan, who owns Baracoa, will suffer for it, especially as I understand it. The pirates will be given back the crafting port, but of course not to WTF. So it's basically an inter-Russian affair between two Russian clans that has been slugging it out. And in my opinion, the battle is, if not over, then I can't really see WTF get back from this. There was a Swedish flip on St. Nicholas where the Swedes was beaten, from what I can tell. I haven't seen any screenshots. I just heard from a couple of the Russian players that the Swedes were beaten in the port battle, and there was a lot of screening action outside of St. Nicholas. These port battles are always good fun for screening. What surprised me was a British attack on Legoneve, which failed, but I have to applaud the Brits for actually trying to take some of the Russian ports in that area back, because, right now the Brits kind of need some momentum, they kind of need some success stories, and I would encourage them to keep doing it, because at some point they're gonna win, and once they kind of break that code on how to win the port battles, I suspect that the Brits has such a numerical player base that they could become a force to be reckoned with in port battles, hopefully. But I'm going to continue a little bit on the Swedish-Russian block war, because if we continue to Great Cone, the Russians flipped Haluva. It was another no-show by the Russians. Basically, this is a continuation of the strategy of just basically fucking with, what's the right word? Shitting on your opponents, because that's what we have become as a general player base. That's great. If we look at Aves, there's been some developments. The Russians attacked and won at Bastere last week, or during the week, and the Swedes have recently flipped Bastere in order to get it back. So that port battle is in a couple of hours from now. As you can tell, this is made on a Monday, and the reason for that is because I'm a little bit sick, so I wasn't really feeling up for it last night. We have had the Danes attacking Plymouth, and we've had the Russians attacking Charlestown. As far as I can tell, Charlestown was another no-show. Plymouth became a huge landslide win for the Swedes. So basically the status quo in that regard, but Bastere will probably be the area to watch this coming week, but I'll get back to that. In the Kristianstad area, you haven't seen that many port battles lately. As you know from last week and the week before that, the Kristianstad area has basically been the most active port battle area in the game. The reason for that being, of course, that there's a really hot war between the Danes and the Swedes. The Danes, of course, being on the receiving end, being on the back foot defending, and the Swedes being the attackers. And since the Swedes put the night timers on their ports, the battles have basically died out a little bit. So what we've seen in the area now is the no-shows, and it's a little bit depressing to see what players are willing to do against one another in order to get a perceived advantage in a war that should really be meaningless. It's a game for all sakes and purposes. Let's continue on. By the way, Vikes is flipped as a morning battle at 6 a.m. in the morning of server time, I believe. Kind of a shitty time for everybody, so that's in that regard, everybody is equal. Great. Let's move on to Guayara, Pampatar region. This is actually one of the more interesting regions because in the focus between the Swedes and the Russians, there is a third power rising in the Caribbean, that's the Prussians, who has really been taking it out on the Dutch, and it's long since past the time where you could call it a friendly rivalry. It's basically become a war of extermination by the Prussians, where they seek to annihilate the Dutch. I can't see. Sorry for that. I can't really say that I care much for it. Basically, because there's only one real agenda going on here, and that is beating on someone who's too weak to actually defend themselves, and I don't care for it much. But that being said, you have to give credit to the Prussians, firstly for just basically grinding on, because at some point it must get a little bit tiresome. If, as you can see, there's a lot of ports in this region that has switched sides. I don't know how many of them has been defended. I haven't actually been seeing that many screenshots from this region, but basically all the screenshots that I have seen has been Prussians annihilating the Dutch, and it just keeps going like that. So it's as far as I can tell, the war is over. The Dutch has been soundly defeated, and at some point the Prussians will end up at Wilhelmstad, and then they won't really be able to go much further than that. What makes this war a little bit more shady is that one of the clans who are attacking the Dutch, the Lions clan, has an alt clan that is actively defending the Dutch, which makes very little sense, at least to me. But it tells you that there's a lot of stories, there's a lot of history here, and a lot of bad blood, because I think that's what the primary moving factor, if you look at the ports. Most of them has been taken by the Lions clan, so basically it's an inter-Dutch affair where the Dutch are settling some old scores, some old debts, in my opinion. I don't know for sure because I haven't actually spoken with any of the Dutch or the Prussian players about it. But from an outside point of view, the only thing that can fuel this conquest is bad blood, basically. Feelings got hurt, someone was touched inappropriately, and now someone wants revenge. If we look at a little bit more interesting contest between the French and the Americans, I told you last week that Canon Macareo would be the hotspot in the region. The French would try to mop up their conquest, and I actually expected the French to be able to do so, but the Americans have been doing a very good job just at keeping their one foothold in that area, and it's going to be interesting to see how the French and the Americans are going to go about the port battles that has been at Canamacareo, and how they will try to either mob up the conquest. I expect the French to continue doing the attacks, and I expect the Americans to continue defending. On a slightly different note, we have a friendly takeover. Santanilos was given to the Spanish by the Swedes. The reason for this is unknown. I don't really see a Spanish need for the port, but congratulations to the Spanish for that, basically. That sort of sums up the developments on the Naval Action's war server this past week. Basically, we have the same alliances slugging it out against one another, and the tactics have become even more hostile to one another in the coming days or in the past week. And I expect these shenanigans to continue until either developers put an end to it by a mechanic change, either a regional server or some form of lobby game. Some sort of punishment system. As far as I can tell, none of the solutions are going to be pleasant for the player base. And to be honest, I don't see anyone having anything to blame but ourselves. We as players have created this situation, and we as players should be basically ashamed of ourselves. I mean, it's the only reason for our tactics is to ruin the game for our fellow players, and that should be something we all should take a step back and feel ashamed about, because it's shitty tactics, it's shitty game development, not necessarily the development of the game. It's a shitty development in the RVR part of the game that we should, as players, address. We have not been able to address it as players, so now I think that we've reached a point where developers need to step in and make a change to the RVR system, a change that will last a good while, because many of the issues we have right now with the no-shows, with the multi-flipping, with the dodge timers, it's actually been problems we've seen ever since the server merge. But for a long while, I think that the players in the game were committed to actually accepting that we had to treat each other with a semblance of respect, a semblance of decency. That respect, that decency has been thrown out of the window, and what we're left with is basically, in my opinion, a poor game enjoyment, poor game play, and we have no one to blame but ourselves as players, and we should really dig real hard, real deep, and find the balls we should have had from the beginning. So with that little pointed finger at everybody, and I have to accept blame as well, because Denmark-Norway has been doing exactly the same things like as everybody else, so there's really no one to blame but everybody. And with that finger pointing in all directions, and I've probably strained my finger a little bit, I will end up my weekly sum up of the RVR segment, and wish you everybody a very fun day. Stay safe out there, and hope to see you all in the open world.